Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome to another interview segment hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Today we'll be speaking with Manolo de Los Santos about Neo-McCarthyism, the crisis of empire, and the recent attacks on various pro-peace organizations here in the U.S. and abroad. Manolo is the co-executive director of the People's Forum and is a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He co-edited most recently Viviremos, Venezuela versus Hybrid Warfare, published by LeftWord Books and 1804 Books in 2020. And he also published Comrade of the Revolution, Selected Speeches of Fidel Castro, likewise by LeftWord Books and 1804 Books in 2021. He is the coordinator of the People's Summit for Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us, Manolo. We'll get started with the interview right after this.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I just gotta say, Manolo, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on today. We're big admirers of your work and of the organizations you work with. So it's really great just for us on a personal level to be able to have this conversation today.
Well, I'm honored. I'm honored just to be with Midwestern Marx, with the two of you, and with all the folks who regularly listen to what you all do.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let's just get right into it, right? Enough of me yapping. Let's start off with basics. Can you tell us a bit about the People's Forum? Right, which is sort of where we're going to be focusing today, what your role is there and what the People's Forum does.
Well, I think the People's Forum has a very similar history to that of Midwestern Marx and a lot of new efforts of political education and of creating socialist consciousness in our time. We started about 5 years ago as a group of organizers, activists, left militants. Some of us, like myself, had been working already on political education in Latin America. And we were actually looking at the changes taking place in the United States. We saw what happened in Ferguson when there was a popular uprising by not just young Black people, but by other young people from across the country. We saw what was coming out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And in general, we saw that there was certain transformations taking place in society and that young people particularly were wanting to take leadership and to be part of transforming society. And from our own experiences with struggles and movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, we understood that none of that is possible without a grounding analysis rooted in the Marxist tradition. And that movements needed to engage with political education. That we needed to develop cadres, that we needed to develop people capable of building organizations and political instruments of the working class. And the People's Forum comes in as a space that basically has the intention of incubating those efforts, of incubating political education, of nurturing internationalism, of putting working class politics at the center of what is considered left politics in the United States. And that has not always been an easy process, but in the last 5 years, we've seen an incredible growth of the spaces that we are part of. And I say that because it's not just the People's Forum. Again, Midwestern Marx and so many different efforts across the country that are sort of developing a new generation of young revolutionaries who are committing themselves to transform reality.
That's really well said. I like what you say about incubating. I feel like that's sort of the stage we're at now, an incubation period, you know?
Yeah, and this is something we always repeat, that uh, we work in quotidian society with this ideas that things just pop out of a void, and or individuals are just great and they come up and do great things. But in reality, it's the historical moment that produces organizations, that produces individuals that end up playing big roles in historical affairs. And the moment that we're in is a moment that is pregnant, I think, with tremendous revolutionary potential. We've had a great transformation in social consciousness in the American people. A lot of the things that in previous periods kept us apart, things that the ruling class proliferated in working class people in order to separate them and divide them, especially in young people, we're seeing that be less and less true today. And it's easier showing solidarity with different working class communities and oppressed communities, and seeing, like when you mentioned Ferguson, when a black person gets killed, it's no longer, oh, they killed an other that I am indifferent to. They killed one of us. And we saw that with the BLM protests in 2020. Like, we were going around to all these protests. It was diverse as hell. It was a lot of people who felt that they killed one of us. So it's a very rich historical moment. But as you said, without theoretical clarity, without a systematic analysis of what's going on, it's going to be, without the organizations that are needed to move us forward, it's going to be very hard to get anything from that just spontaneous, rebellious attitude that we've seen dissipate a little bit as of the last couple of years. But there was recently a hit piece, of course, which is going to be the central topic of our conversation, but a hit piece on the New York Times trying to smear the People's Forum along with Code Pink and the Tricontinental Institute as puppets of the Communist Party of China. So what happened there? Did Xi Jinping bribe you guys to believe the same things that you've kind of always believed? Or do you think it's possible that, maybe the New York Times, the pinnacle of corporate media, is, I don't know, maybe misleading the people? What do you think?
Well, I think many things, but I'll start with the People's Forum and other organizations. I think have made a big, have committed a big crime in terms of how the U.S. understands many things. We committed the crime of not actually just talking about Black people being killed. One thing is to stand up and lament, the war that America has against Black people and against poor people, and to talk about domestic issues. Another is to only talk about international issues and to lament other people being killed in other parts of the world. But we made the terrible mistake of wanting to talk about both things in connection with each other. We've, for the beginning, insisted that the struggles of working people in this country, the struggles of Black people in this country, and of other minority groups in this country, are deeply connected to the struggles for liberation and against exploitation all over the planet. That we cannot separate the struggles of our people in the South Bronx, but in Mississippi and in North Dakota and in California, from the struggles of people fighting sanctions in Venezuela. And we cannot separate it from the struggles of people in the Arab world and the Maghreb. And we cannot separate it from the successful examples of countries that are trying to build socialism against all odds. That has been our terrible, our egregious mistake that has angered certain people. And the New York Times has recently published this article essentially making the allegation that we are unregistered foreign agents of a foreign government, of the Chinese government. For what? In their proof, Roy Singham having a hammer and sickle on the corner of his notebook? Because we have defended the right of China to develop. that we have celebrated the fact that China has lifted millions of people out of poverty, and we think that's an interesting model to study because we have hosted events in our space and with other organizations and thousands of people across not just the United States but around the world calling for not another Cold War focused on China and Russia. That's essentially what it is, you know? And I think that the dangerous element of all of this, you know, as much as we want to laugh at the New York Times because they have essentially engaged in what they've done historically, which is in factless investigation, factless journalism, journalism without any serious basis, without any serious investigation, in order to lead and trigger wars and trigger invasions and trigger coups and trigger violence against the people of the world. They have now published this article with, in my belief, the hopes to trigger acts of repression and violence against those who stand in the way of warmongering against China. Already, immediately, the first person to respond to their trigger was Marco Rubio, who I wouldn't even call him a right-wing congressman. He's a far-right congressperson who has consistently not just taking a position against the people of Cuba and Venezuela, but has basically stood on the wrong side of any possible issue that's ever come before him. You name it. He's on the side of racism. He's on the side of homophobia. He's on the side of every possible position that you could be considered as just or necessary. Marco Rubio is always on the wrong side. And we expect that this article has triggered other investigations or has triggered other queries in other sectors of the US government and Congress. We will have to see what comes out of it, but that must have been clearly the intention of the New York Times in publishing such a repressive McCarthyite attack on us.
Yeah, it seems as if these things are getting more and more common as 2023 rolls on. But, you know, I was looking at because of this, I was looking at Marco Rubio's Twitter earlier today and how wildly unpopular he is. He put out a tweet calling Diaz-Canel a dictator, right? It got 40 likes and then just thousands of replies just bashing him. And it seems to me that the reason that this all comes out, especially to people like you guys who are making the connection between their international and national agendas, and not just their agendas, but the outcomes of those agendas on the people, it strikes me as not a coincidence that things ramp up now and the massive unpopularity of such figures. I mean, our country's really enmeshed in turmoil, right? There's the rise of the new anti-imperialist bloc and our ruling class finding it more and more difficult to maintain its power and protect its profits on this international level, right? And then on the national level, it's suffering from a crisis of legitimacy as the vast majority of the working population distrust its government officials and the lapdogs they have in the mainstream media. I think everyone makes that connection. Of course, these are all outcomes of the capitalist system itself, right? Running up against its inherent contradictions. But as we speak of outcomes, my question is, what role do you think that this combined comprehensive crisis that the U.S. is undergoing plays in this ramping up of Neo-McCarthyism, in the smears of dissident voices and things like that?
I mean, I think it's important to always start from our concrete analysis of the concrete conditions in which we're living in. And certainly we're living in a moment of great crisis, not just for the United States, but for the world as a whole. This system that we live in continues to have no answers for the dilemmas that humanity faces. It has no answers to the needs of the millions of people who continue to not live, but barely survive under the current conditions of life. And in this crisis, which for a long time, the US, to a certain extent, could protect its own population from, It has proved incapable of even meeting the needs of its own people. This has generated the moment we're living in right now, where we started talking about, where you have a larger percentage of young people in this country, even if they don't formally identify as communists, even if they've never picked up the Communist Manifesto in their lives, but they continue to raise questions. Why? Because why must we continue to live this way? Why is it that in this country that supposedly has it all and has opportunities for everyone, you can be a PhD and still live in your car and not have enough to eat? How is that possible? And I think in a moment like this of major crisis, a crisis that again has no visible out, there's no visible exit that the ruling class can even throw as crumbs to people at this point, other than say, vote for one decrepit old man or vote for another decrepit old man in a rotten system. They are seeking to intimidate any pushback. What did they do after Ferguson? Intimidate and repress as much as possible in order to stop young people from coming out on the street. Obviously, we know that didn't exactly work the way they wanted to, because in 2020, there was an even larger uprising of young people across the country. Close to 20 million or more young people, not just Black, but of all colors, but predominantly working class young people who went out into the streets against the white supremacist and capitalist system. Sadly, we didn't have the leadership or the organization to take that to its logical conclusions, but it was a moment. And again, in light of that, they tried to intimidate and repress. Now, they are using not just the China, but the Russia boogeyman as an excuse, as the ghost with which they want to intimidate young people wanting to fight back now. They will use it as an excuse to justify why we have to vote for a blue decrepit old man or a red decrepit old man. They will force us into positions that most young people are actually unwilling to accept at this point. But we have to be clear that unlike in the earlier periods of the McCarthy period, the initial McCarthy period, when many communists were forced to go underground, when many communists had to renounce their ideas, when many communists and socialists had to find other ways to exist politically and publicly, we're at a stage in history where the crisis being so deep, we have nowhere else to go but to go further into the struggle and further into work with people in this country. We have no time to actually stay quiet. We have no plans to go down in this crisis with our mouths shut. In that, they've made a major mistake. And I actually think that the China question, the way they're raising it, is almost a laughable one. Do they really think that we need Chinese money to do the things we do? Do we really need Chinese funds to actually express our anger, our frustration with a society that has no future for us? I do that gladly for free every day. Today and tomorrow. They will never understand that. And that is partly based on the fact that whenever they incentivize change, regime change plans, coups, invasions in other countries, they only do it on the basis of money. They've never been able to convince any group of people ever on the planet to do anything on the basis of ideas. They've never been able to convince anyone to take up action for good, only to be paid by the US government. That's why they do regime change plans in Cuba, how they do regime change plans in Eastern Europe. That's what they did in Ukraine. That's what they've tried to do in Venezuela. They don't know any other way. But our way, our path is different. Our path is actually a path of building working class power, of building it from the bottom up. If people think, and our 990s are transparent, the money, what money we have is out there. If anyone thinks that's real money, it's a joke. The money we've received from foundations and other entities where Roe Singham is involved, that money is a joke compared to the money that actually gets spent by the ruling class and their minions and their nonprofits and their institutions and their think tanks to actually destroy people's movements around the world. Our budgets alone are a fraction of what the US government spends every year in trying to destroy the Cuban Revolution. Our budget is infinitely smaller than what they spent alone on TV Marti and Radio Marti to just pass propaganda against the Cuban Revolution, which, by the way, doesn't even get listened to in Cuba, but they continue to spend millions of dollars on it. So despite the deep crisis, we have a responsibility to fight on.
That's so beautifully said, and you're absolutely right. Even the case of Cuba you have with the Cuba Money Project that Tracy Eden runs, I think it's been like $1 trillion to $2 trillion in the last decade or two that has been spent on anti Cuban government media sources, both in Cuba and in Miami. And I wonder whether whether anyone really listens to them outside of Miami, because even we were talking a little bit earlier about Rubio and his lack of popularity. I up until very recently was a frequent I frequently stayed in Miami. That's where I had grown up, and even there, like the young people that were born and bred on the anti-communism of their parents and grandparents, they see a futureless future, and those ideas, they stop making sense. And once you begin to see an opening in one area, it's so much easier to tear it apart completely. But yeah, I think everything you've said has been tremendously pertinent. And when it comes to repression and the ramping of it, that's conjoined with the development of these crises that we're seeing, it's also quite comprehensive. Like we've faced our fair share of censorship. We had 7 TikTok accounts that were banned. The first one was banned when the special military operations started last year, and that was an account that was on a weekly basis reaching tens of millions of people, debunking imperialist lies, talking about Marxism, and they can't have that. And so, and it's all reflective of like the change in algorithmic controls and the control over what gets seen from a Chinese company, ByteDance, to Oracle. And it hasn't only been us that have had accounts banned. The folks at Mint Press News have had their accounts banned, and they've had their PayPals banned of specific journalists. And we've had the Uhuru movement leaders be arrested. So it's been such a comprehensive attack through various fields of any form of dissenting voice that gets a little bit of traction with the American people. So how do you see that sort of those sorts of repressive attacks going in the next few years? And what do you think are some of the best ways to fight them?
Well, I like to think about Reagan's ghost sometime. I like to think about the fact that the US spent billions of dollars in its confrontation with the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. It spent billions of dollars to destroy the Soviet Union. Billions of dollars to declare in 1991 that history had ended. And still, 30 years later, there are still communists who live and breathe. There are still communists still engaging in struggle all over the world. And more importantly, sadly, because they're not materialists, they don't even understand this, but the class struggle never ended, even after the so-called end of history. The class struggle continued, and masses of people, millions of people around the world, continue to mobilize and organize themselves against this cruel and inhumane system of capitalism. And in part, their comprehensiveness, their desire to stamp out all dissent, to stamp out all struggle, to eliminate any forms of resistance, is in part to what we're living in this moment, to all this diversity of struggles that are building up. which again, it's not against us. We are but a fragment of this movement that is building in the United States and building around the world. It is against Midwestern Marx. It is against the Uhuru movement. It is against the protesters in Cop City. It is against the indigenous movement in the United States. It is against the women's movement in the United States, but not just in the United States. I mean, just last week we saw our comrades from the landless workers movement in Brazil being interrogated for 7 hours in front of Congress about their struggle for land reform and being questioned in many in the same ways. What is your relationship with China? As if China is the reason why peasants in Brazil actually have to fight for the right to land and the right to feed their families. We see the attacks against the Socialist Party of Zambia. Comrade Fred Membe being continuously harassed and arrested. Coincidentally, after having been in China and Russia, giving amazing declarations about how the third world views the current correlation of forces. We're not alone in this moment. And I think precisely seeing that we're not alone, but that we're seeing these acts of repression against many of us around the world is important, and also recognizing that there are millions in the struggle, that there's an active movement of history that's trying to rebuild and transform the world we live in. That is not just young people in the US who are tired of living the way we're living. That there are millions of people around the world who actually want to see a socialist future. And I think that is becoming much more of a pressing issue in a post-COVID world where not has just the US lost legitimacy, but any sense of their American dream that had been nurtured for decades. What remains of it? Very little. The ideological machine of the United States, in a sense, is on the defensive now. And if they're on the defensive, it means we have to go on the offensive. That's why it's important of having these spaces where we're talking, we're engaging, we're building in the battle of ideas, just like Fidel called us to engage in. The battle of ideas against those who think only of profit over life, against those who want to insist on a future where the majority of the planet not only has no say, but has no possibility to live a life of dignity. The world refuses to accept that. And luckily, we have, in this moment, a new correlation of forces that is building up, where other nations are clearly presenting a challenge at the state level of what the US is actually capable of doing.
That's really, really well said. And it makes me think that they try not to change up their playbooks when they don't have to. And it feels to me like they are making the same mistake about our new conditions. In this era, we refer to it as reproletarianization, right? The death of the middle classes in the West. But they're sort of trying to handle all of these different revolutionary forces rising up all around the world, all over the new anti-imperialist bloc at the state level, like you were saying. The way they handled the Soviet Union, though, which came out of a mistake of how they viewed the Soviet Union in the first place. You said something earlier, Manolo, that really struck me when you said that you engage in this fight every day for free, right? That you don't need Chinese money to do this because it's just what's in your interest to do. There's nothing else to do at this point but fight. And this is what they never understood, even about the Soviet Union, who took a much more covertly active hand in revolutions all over the world than, China does today. And so they treat this as if, the Soviet Union are pulling a bunch of strings all over the world, and they're the ones controlling, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. They're the ones controlling the Cuban Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And they look at China now in that exact same mistake. And for China and for right now, it's completely different, even from as involved as the USSR was. China takes a way different strategy and tactic on its internationalism. It goes about it differently. But what I'd really like to get into right now, though, is this international question, right? We're seeing, like you were talking about, these amazingly progressive movements going all over the world, but especially on the African continent, from the EFF movement in South Africa and all the corporate media smears against them, and Julius Malema, going back to all the old white supremacist standards, to Burkina Faso and what's happening in Niger, right? Could you take a minute, though, to just explain the essential role of the African continent in this new era? The era everybody's referring to as multipolar. How is this and the rising movements in Africa now affecting imperialist interests and imperialism itself?
Well, I think these are questions that are often put up for debate among the left, and I think really good debates. My opinion is that we're still far away from actually turning or becoming or starting a multipolar era. I think we're precisely in a moment where different states, particularly in the global south and the third world, are beginning to assert their independence and their sovereignty, and in different ways to create their own political agendas and their own paths to development that are coming more and more in contradiction with the US. And we see that across the political spectrum and ideological spectrum as well. And I think, some people are asking, is BRICS socialist? Is BRICS anti-imperialist? Is multipolarity a socialist thing? I don't think it needs to be. I think these are moments where what the world needs is not purity. Purity is not what moves history. It's precisely the contradictions in which we live in, and the contradictions that arise from struggle are all over the planet. So I applaud this moment that humanity is living in which we're advancing history in difficult moments. A sign of that is what's happening in West Africa. Could it have been possible 3 years ago for masses of people in the Sahel region, for US trained military officers in those countries to have rebelled against US and French imperialism? Not possible. The correlation of forces 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, was not favorable to an independent movement of people in the global south. Could the governments in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, in India have challenged the US on elements of foreign policy 3 years ago? I don't think that would have been possible. The world has changed tremendously since then. And what we're seeing now are positive steps. When we look specifically at what's happening in Niger, where finally there is a coup that isn't initiated by the French embassy or the US embassy, but is a coup by patriotic military officers, it's a breath of fresh air for the people of Africa. The youngest continent, the continent that has the capacity not only to feed and sustain itself, but to feed and sustain humanity, but who's been forced essentially to surrender all of its resources and all of its people for the benefit of the global north. To see Niger standing up is amazing. To see a young leader, Ibrahim Traore, he's my age, we're the same age. He's in his mid-30s, who stands up and isn't just saying no to imperialism, but is actually talking about the need to develop on their own terms. That is amazing. That is an inspiration. That is, again, a breath of fresh air, not just for the people of the Sahel, of West Africa, but for the people of the world. And I think this is a tendency that's taking place all over. I mean, you mentioned the EFF, but there are a mass of movements all across the African continent that are coming together. The People's Forum is part of the International People's Assembly, and we work with a host of organizations in West Africa, from the Communist Party of Benin, to the trade unions of Niger, to the trade unions of Nigeria, to parties in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. And all of them coincide in that this is a clear moment, a demarcation in history in the struggle against French imperialism and US imperialism, and of a clear rejection of NATO. Some of people thought we were crazy. I actually don't want to say some people. Certain left intellectuals in the global north, who consider themselves to be a majority, but who are in fact a minority, thought we were crazy for denouncing NATO at the onset of the war in Ukraine. For them, they thought NATO was somehow still a defensive project. We were clearly denouncing more than a year ago that NATO is an imperialist project that not only was trying to confront Russia, but was trying to assert domination of the planet as a whole. And many of us said early on that Africa would become one of the battlefields where NATO would be contested. That is what we're seeing now. So young revolutionaries, I think, in the United States, but all over the world, must see what's happening and say, even if we don't know, some people are asking, what is the class character of the coup in Niger or in Burkina Faso, Mali? Even if we don't know the exactitudes of that, we have to stand with the masses of people around the world, and in particularly in West Africa, who are saying no to US imperialism, no to French imperialism, no to NATO. That is the actual majority of people on the planet. That's who happens to be on the right side of history.
That's so beautifully said, brother. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We spend quite a bit of our energies criticizing that part of the left that I think you hinted at, that because something, a movement across the world, or a part of the working class, or a part of their history isn't pure enough, it just rejects it wholesale, that it makes the precondition for judging something favorably, whether it's pure or not. And it contains within that process a paradox, which is that imperialism can always sustain all of its impurities and destruction and killing of millions and millions of lives, but it will somehow never be too impure enough to support or to have some rational calculation about why the liberal side of imperialism is somehow the lesser of two evils, and therefore we should support it. How do you guys tend to approach those sorts of questions and debates? Because one of the things that we've had to deal with, I think, in the history of the U.S. left, at least, is a whole lot of covert operations that have diluted what Marxism is, that have propped up this form of Western Marxism that is devoid of the revolutionary substance of Marxism, that is thoroughly in line with imperialist projects and in many cases deeply pessimistic and has nothing to feed anyone except for academics trying to get their papers into peer-reviewed journals. So how do you guys navigate that sort of space, and what role do you see the project of criticizing that left that was fabricated by the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other projects? What role do you see the criticism of that left in our period having?
I think there's a certain gut reaction always. There's a gut instinct, which is a material force. It's not some mystical idea, that we are constantly and permanently in opposition to US imperialism. There can never be a conflict in which somehow we are on the side of US imperialism. Not even a little bit. Under no condition. Under no condition can we accept that it's somehow okay to send weapons to Ukraine, or that there's some minor agreement, even tactical, that we can have with the US and their imperialist force. Never. So that's one. That's our starting point. Second, is that we are not idealists. We're not motivated simply by feelings of justice or feelings of solidarity, which are important, but that's not what concretely moves us. When we are observing these debates, when we are observing what's happening in the world, our instinct is to also go to a Marxist analysis, to a materialist analysis. What is at play? Who are the characters? What is the correlation of forces? What are the consequences of the actions that are taking place in society? We want to look at the economic and social and political factors and the cultural factors in any given situation. And most importantly, not to listen to one or so individuals, but to listen to what the masses are doing and saying through their organized forms of struggle. What are the revolutionaries on the ground saying and doing? All these things inform us in these debates. And our approach, at least from the People's Forum, has been to not necessarily engage in debates with some of these, I would call them imperialist sympathizing leftists. Those who want to say they're internationalists from below, that their solidarity is from below. They don't have solidarity with larger processes or with states. Those who believe in purity without contradiction. We don't engage with them. We have our work. We were busy this whole summer organizing a political education school that had thousands of students involved on Pan-Africanism. And it was not a coincidence that we were doing this Pan-African summer school while this was unfolding on the African continent, because this is what we've been talking about for years now. That's where we sort of take the debate, actually. Let's take the debate to young people and the masses who actively want to grow and want to build and actually believe in the urgency of organization and struggle in our times. That's where we take it. We understand that polemicizing is an important part of our political formation, and there are comrades who do it much better than us, which is why we don't necessarily engage with it. But in the times that we're living in, which is a moment of the battle of ideas, we do not shy away from making our positions well known, even if people think that that's simply a pro-China or pro-Russia position. We are much more articulate and sophisticated than sometimes people want to give us credit, but we don't care how people perceive that. The important thing is that we are talking to everyday people about everyday problems and also looking for everyday solutions, not simply from the ivory towers of our universities, from the security of our homes, making outlandish comments, critiquing one thing or the other.
That's so well said, brother. I feel like we often get lost in bickering. And at the Institute, we try very, very hard to stay out of all of that. We criticize ideas rather than people, and simply put out what we believe is the Marxist analysis of a given thing. It seems to me, though, that people often, and you never know who's for real and who's not, who's there trying to wreck the organizing and who isn't, etc. So it's just a lot easier to do that. And there's also a level of this where we need to be able to understand the difference between speaking about and to organizers and revolutionaries and about and to the masses of working people, right? It feels often like we blur that line, and a lot of people on the left will sort of forget that we need to take positive steps. You mentioned the positive steps earlier, right? That countries all over the world is taking, and we sort of get stuck in this mode where, well, they're not, at the last step of the process where I want them to be yet. So we condemn them wholesale, right? But I don't know. It seems to me that we need to drop this, what we call the purity fetish, in these situations and maintain a more principled Marxist analysis. I mean, we get so much hate, I guess is a good word, for always sticking to our guns on this. We're always reaching out a hand to working class, poor people, oppressed people, wherever they are, rather than canceling them or, critiquing them when we find it more helpful to reach out a hand and say, come with us. Right. So I'm sort of veering out of the planned questions, but what role do you see the sort of spontaneous organizing of working people and the concrete institutions of revolutionaries? How do you see these interacting on a sort of more concrete level in the future?
Well, we're facing a lot of challenges in the organization of our class. I mean, we're going through a moment where, because of decades of anti-communism, because of decades of repression, because of decades of class struggle in which the ruling class has been much more conscious and organized, many of the organizations and instruments of the working class to fight back have been weakened. So that opens up the radius to many forms of spontaneous action, organization, new forms of political organizing, collectives, and so on, that don't necessarily fit the traditional mind, framework that many communists envision. But in my own thinking and the thinking a lot of our comrades here in the People's Forum, from our own process of political education and study, we think strongly that we're living in a period much like Marx in the period of the First International, where Marxist ideas don't necessarily hold hegemony within the left. We're having to battle, even ideologically, within the left against people who still believe, just like they did in Marxist time, that mutual aid societies or projects are the solution or the way out. We have to battle out with those who only believe in reforms for the sake of reforms. We have to battle out with people within our own left ranks who do not understand clearly the nature and the questions of imperialism in our time. But that is the time we're living in. And our push consistently has to be to strengthen and to build the organizations of the working class. For example, at the People's Forum, we are clear what our role is. We are political educators. We are political agitators, but we are not the organization of the working class. That's just why in our courses, in our spaces, in our activities, and everything we do, we encourage young people to organize and to become part of revolutionary organizations. We don't tell them which one to join. We tell them to study and to read and to debate and to learn. Whether it is to join the PSL or to join the CPUSA or to join DSA or whatever organization it is, but we encourage people to think. And most importantly, to fight. We want thinkers and fighters in our time. And we see, for example, in the struggle of the UPS workers, in the struggle of many workers across the country, workers, our class is a class full of contradictions. If we were perfect, we would have already won this battle. We would have already defeated the bourgeoisie. But that is not the case. We are, in fact, a class full of contradictions, filled with, in fact, many backward and retrograde ideas. Yet, it is the class that we are fighting for. It's the class that I believe in. It's the class that I actually feel has the capacity. It's the only social group and economic group in society that actually has the power and the capacity to transform society for better. So I've made my bets. I want to be with this sometimes difficult, sometimes backward, sometimes very contradictory group of people, but who actually will transform the world and will transform history, will transform society. That is my people.
That is so beautifully said, brother. And That itself is a statement that I think goes. It wouldn't sit very well with some parts of the left that consider a section of our working class to be a basket of deplorables, in the words of Comrade Hillary Clinton. But there's tremendous potential in all in working people of all backgrounds in our country. Everyone's feeling the burden at different levels, but everyone's feeling the burden of this crisis of capitalist imperialism, and they're looking for ways out. And sometimes the ways that they find are not the best, but we should ask ourselves before condemning them, were we there to present ourselves as an actual option to them? Because if they didn't know if we existed, or we didn't do a good enough job at getting to them, or when we engage with them it was condescendingly or something, there's some reflection that has to be done at what role it is that we're playing in sort of leading them towards sectors where we would hope them to not be going. But yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I wanted to ask one question. You spent quite a bit of time in Cuba. You've met with Diaz-Canel a few times, which is pretty awesome. And I wanted to ask, the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, just recently had their 10th anniversary conference. It was a huge event. It looked like a Rolling Stones concert of sorts, and it had everyone talking about it. Elon Musk tweeted some dumb bullshit about them doing a white genocide or something, or promoting a white genocide. But one of the things that I noticed was that they had a massive Cuban flag there in the stadium, and that's something you usually see in these liberation movements in the African continent. Can you speak a little bit about the role that that Cuba has played in helping Africa fight against neocolonialism, against imperialism, for its sovereignty, and what role is that? What role is the Cuban Revolutionary Project playing today as an inspiration to a lot of these movements?
I mean, if there's one country in the world where people across lines are adamantly, vehemently, publicly, and clearly in support of the Cuban Revolution, it's South Africa. I mean, that was the EFF rally, which was amazing and outstanding. But COSATU and the SACP, organizations that I also admire, also constantly are doing large events and mass mobilizations in defense of the Cuban Revolution against the blockade. NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, I think it's the second largest trade union in the African continent, and it's probably the only trade union in the continent that declares itself a Marxist-Leninist trade union. Constantly goes out in defense of the Cuban Revolution. I think there's a general movement of people and organizations across the African continent that defend Cuba. And I think it would be one-sided to just assume that is because of Cuba's great sacrifices and contributions towards the liberation of the African continent. Yes, Cuba sacrificed lives, its people, its resources to defend Angolan independence, to liberate Namibia, to end apartheid in South Africa. But there's also a clear love for Cuba because of the model, the political model it represents. In the continent of Africa, millions of young people are faced with unemployment. They're faced with hunger, with deprivation, with lack of healthcare, with lack of a future. And they're told that this is so because they are poor and corrupt countries. And now they tell them that it is so because, of course, Chinese imperialism. Chinese imperialism is what's keeping the African people poor. So-called Chinese debt traps, which we know is all ridiculous and without facts. But then there's Cuba, and people can look to Cuba, as so many young people across the continent do, and say, well, look at Cuba. It's a poor country, but look, it has dignity. Its people have healthcare. Its people have education. It's a sense of moral and political example that is shining across the continent. I think that's, for not just the EFF, but for many mass political organizations across the African continent, a clear example. And ultimately, that's what the US is constantly attacking. The possibility that people see in Cuba a path forward, a similar third world country capable of transforming its reality, of taking its destiny into its own hands. And that is definitely scary to certain people in Washington. They are doing everything they can to make sure this example doesn't spread. Because what would it look like even if just half the countries on the African continent chose a path of sovereignty and dignity and independence? That would be a threat to the major interests of the United States and their NATO allies.
And, just to add on to that, what would it look like if, working class Americans right here stood up and said, we stand with them? That, our government has no business doing what it's doing over there. And I think that's another thing that they're terrified of, which is, one of the reasons we're constantly fed these narratives with no basis in reality about, workers' movements all over the world. We're sort of getting towards the hour mark here. But before we wrap up, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure hearing you speak, brother. It inspires me. Like, there were a few moments where I was sitting here off camera going like,
he does a lot of pen pointing, and that's his signal move. When he likes a point, he pen points. And I was seeing him; he was doing a whole lot of pen pointing today.
It's a Jewish thing.
We're gonna put it on a shirt. That's gonna be one of the first Midwestern Marx Institute shirts. Noah pen pointing. But you're so right about you're so right about Cuba being such a tremendous example, and I'm always reminded of this quote that comes from Fidel, and it's right around the time when it's very clear that something's going on with the USSR, and it hadn't fell yet, but it was about to fall. And he makes a statement about, in front of Gorbachev, I believe, that the greatness of a nation is not measured by its GDP, nor is it measured by its population. The greatness of a nation is measured by its ideals and its people's commitment to those ideals. And without those strong ideals, without the creation of what Che called a new men and women, without thoroughly embedding themselves in the tradition of Martí, that trenches of ideas are worth a hell of a lot more than trenches of rocks, the Cuban people would not have been able to survive the plethora of hybrid warfare, sanctions, blockades that they've faced from the U.S. And I've read statistics that the special period cut calories by a little bit more than half. It's how does the people take that and say, no, it doesn't matter the conditions that we're in, we're going to keep fighting for our sovereignty and for the improvement of those conditions and for the lifting of the blockade, which is the root of these conditions. But it's just so tremendously inspiring, the level of transformation, of consciousness, of hearts that the Cuban Revolution has been able to achieve. And the fight that we have here at home for getting our ruling elite, which is the same elite that keeps us poor, that keeps us immiserated, indebted to debt slavery, for getting sick or getting an education. Me and my wife dared to get an education, and now we're 100K in the hole. That's the reality of the vast majority of young Americans. But this same enemy that we share here as poor and working class people is the same one that's been trying to overthrow Cuba for the last 6 decades. And it's so important that we fight to topple this order that's wobbling. But as Lenin said, it can wobble all it wants, it won't fall unless we topple it. But it's been, I want to reiterate with Noah, it's been a tremendous pleasure speaking with you. We got to bring you back on again and talk to you again. But is there anything you'd like to plug before we head out, brother?
No, just to say thank you to you, comrades. I mean, we feel at the People's Forum that, again, we're part of a larger current that's developing in the United States and around the world, that we are part, of a movement that's building. and that saying, you know, just like our ancestors, the Maroons, the Cimarrones, we refuse to go back to the plantation. We refuse to go back to the chains of bondage. We refuse. Our sight is on moving history forward. The history that they say ended in 1991, we are living proof, all of us here in this room, that it is far from dead or over. You know, class struggle has not ended. And I applaud the efforts of Midwestern Marx Institute, but all the other collective and institutions and projects that are developing socialist consciousness in our times. With slight differences here and there, contradictions, our lack of agreement on certain things, but we are moving history. And that's the important step that so many in Washington and in the New York Times and in other liberal and conservative media like fear. But they won't be able to stop it. They won't be able to stop it. History is already moving faster than they are. So again, my honor to be with you all. And like Fidel said in his speech in the court in Santiago, 1953, the people will have the last word. The masses will have the last word. It won't be capitalism that has the last word. It will be the masses.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. So with that, we're going to go out the way we always do, the same way we go in with the International. I hope everybody checks out the many organizations that Manolo is a part of. We will put links in the description when this goes up on YouTube. And everybody have a great rest of your night. We'll see you next time.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.